Good morning, good day, everyone. Thank you for attending the side events to the annual debate on women, peace, and security. My name is Salma Kahale, and I'm the interim MENA director at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This event will focus on the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda in Palestine and the challenges in the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in the context of occupation. I will start with some housekeeping rules, so we are sure that anyone who needs interpretation has all the technical support needs that they need, and that if you are on your computer, you will have something similar to what you're currently seeing on the screen. There is an interpretation link at the bottom right corner of your screen. Please select Arabic or English according to your preference. As you do that, please press mute original audio so you don't hear the original language being spoken. If you're listening from your mobile, you will be able to see 3 dots on top, and you will be able to tap it and choose the language. Also, please press mute original audio so you don't hear the original language being spoken, and click done. If you have questions for today's panelists, use the Q&A box at the bottom center of your computer or phone screen. We have allocated time to answer questions from attendees at the end of the session. If you have any technical issues during the session and need assistance or want to make a general comment, please use the general chat for that. This session will be recorded and live streamed on Facebook and will be available later on our social media platforms. If you wish to tweet during this discussion, please use the hashtag WPS in Palestine. If anyone has a problem with this session being recorded, or if you encounter any other issues throughout the session, do let us know via the email you can see displayed on the screen. Great. And now, without further ado, the General Union of Palestinian Women and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom are delighted to have the opportunity to hold a webinar on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Palestine, challenges to the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 under occupation, with a number of expert panelists we're very lucky to have with us today. In today's discussion, our panel will be providing a gendered analysis of the impact of the Israeli occupation on Palestinians in order to inform the discussion about women, peace and security, and the occupation in Palestine. The panel will address the challenges in implementing the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security in Palestine 21 years after its adoption. With us today in the panel is Ms. Sawsan Shannar Saleh. She's a member of the Palestinian National Council and the Central Committee of the Palestinian Democratic Union, and a member of the General Secretariat of the General Union of Palestinian Women. She will be speaking to us about the status of women and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda under occupation, and particularly the impact of home demolitions on Palestinian women. We're also delighted to be joined by Ms. Rima Nazzal, a member of the Palestinian National Council, a member of the General Secretariat of the General Union of Palestinian Women, and the current president of Al-Najda Association for Women Development in the West Bank, who will speak to us about the efforts of the State of Palestine to implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the shortcomings of the efforts, and the challenges to its implementation. Joining us today is also Ms. Amal Siam. She is a women's rights activist and advocate, a trainer and a researcher. She will be speaking about the Gaza context and the impact of the siege on Palestinian women. Dr. Selma Nems is also with us today. She has been the Secretary General of the Jordanian National Commission for Women since 2014 and is a member of the advisory group to the High-Level Task Force on Financing for Gender Equality for the United Nations. She will be speaking about the situation of Palestinian women refugees in Jordan and the implementation of the Jordanian National Action Plan. We're also honored to have with us the UN's Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Its Causes and Consequences, Ms. Reem El-Salem, who will be connecting the mandate's theme with the Women, Peace, Security Agenda in Palestine. We're delighted to have you all with us today. Thank you for joining. First, I would like to turn the floor over to Norway's Deputy Representative to the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Erling Huam, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for giving me the floor. Excellencies, let me start by emphasizing yet again, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are universal. No one should accept the claim that culture, religion, geography, or political affiliation determines which rights women are entitled to. The core problem is entrenched power structures preventing women from gaining access to their full rights. These power structures must be exposed and changed. It needs concerted efforts. It needs dialogue. Norway was honored to support and attend the two-day high-level dialogue on women, peace and security in Gaza last week that gathered women and men from all parts of Palestine. It was heated, and it became evident that the younger generation of women, peace and security activists are not granted the space they should have to voice their perspectives or to meaningfully participate. Disagreements, even unfortunate personal attacks occurred. Still, the event was important and hopefully a first step for further women-led mediation and reconciliation. It is crucial that Palestinian women and organizations work together and support each other, especially since, unfortunately, support from many men and male-dominated institutions in Palestine is not yet always something that can be taken for granted. Throughout last week's Women, Peace and Security Week in the Security Council, Norway reiterated that women need to have an equal and meaningful role in peace processes. We also stated that if peace and security is our aim, we should invest more in women's participation and protection, not as an end in itself, but as a prerequisite for peace and stability. We pledge to quadruple our target for funding in this field in our next National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security. Norway also committed to provide seed funding for a new mechanism by the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. It will provide flexible funding to support women human rights defenders at risk for both their participation and protection, not one at the cost of the other. Advancing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Palestine is challenging. With no peace process, decades of occupation, political strife, and the fragmentation between the West Bank and Gaza. Despite Palestinian accession to several core international human rights conventions, discrimination in national legislation still remain as the hallmarks of society where half of the population is keeping the power to themselves. This situation hinders women's empowerment and equality in society. It continues to increase women's vulnerability to violence. It is an obstacle to full economic, political, and social participation. Still, we firmly believe that Palestinian women are the biggest untapped potential to achieving durable peace, conflict prevention, and security for Palestine. Palestinian women have always been active in Palestinian civil society. To secure durable peace and conflict prevention in Palestine, the path towards self-determination must be walked also by women. Ensuring a safe and enabling environment for a free and vibrant civil society in Palestine, including for those working to defend the rights of all Palestinian women, is crucial. Palestinian civil society organizations must be allowed to carry out their work and to advocate for human rights. Respecting human rights and democratic principles are important prerequisites for peace and stability. Earlier this year, we welcomed the adoption of Palestine's second National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, funded by Norway. Priority should now be given to its implementation. We're also proud to have funded civil society's national advocacy strategy for implementing the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, a plan based on needs and priorities identified by Palestinian women. As an elected member of the Security Council for 2021 to 2022, Norway is making use of our experience in peace diplomacy and promotion of women's participation to strengthen the Council's conflict prevention and resolution efforts. Norway will continue to be an outspoken defender of international law at the Security Council and elsewhere. Yes, the occupation is the main obstacle for Palestinian women, but it is also about time now for a game changer. Palestine must achieve change from within to be in a strong position to address the obstacles posed from outside. The international challenges must be addressed. The internal challenges must be addressed. A society dominated by men. Imagine what powerful impact for the Palestinian cause, what Palestine can achieve if Palestine would be able to promote, lift, showcase, share, and hear Palestinian women in politics, in business, in peace and reconciliation. I'm looking forward to this event. I hope you will be all inspired by the discussions and that new forward and inward oriented strategies will emerge. Shukran.
Thank you for your remarks. I will now turn to Ms. Maryse Guimond, UN Women's Special Representative in Palestine, for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Dear guests, gender equality advocates, I am honored to be invited to speak at this side event to the annual debate on women, peace, and security. I would like to thank WILPF and the General Union of Palestinian Women for their kind invitation, as well as the government of Norway for sponsoring the event. This year, we celebrate the 21st anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The landmark resolution, followed by 9 subsequent resolutions, reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace building, humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction. It also stresses the importance of women's equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. In the context of Palestine, the implementation of Resolution 1325 is of essential importance. Palestinian women, including young women, have an unrelenting ambition and the right to play a role in shaping a future that is peaceful and secure, and where they and their communities can thrive. However, they have to deal with several obstacles towards this goal. The occupation and resulting violence negatively impact local women peace builders, causing ongoing challenges and regular setbacks for their work. Women have to deal with their work being precarious, ongoing worries for their physical safety, and setbacks to their organization. Physical barriers, including restrictions of movement, the construction of the wall, checkpoints, closures, and the Gaza blockade, in addition to recurrent hostilities, have also impacted women's livelihood and their physical and emotional well-being. Women organizations' interventions are hindered by rules and limitations imposed by the Israeli authorities, which may raise arbitrary restrictions to their work, as recent events have confirmed. Palestinian women live in a society that is still heavily patriarchal, male-dominated, with traditional gender roles. Women still have to break through persistent negative perceptions restrictive social norms and attitudes, including from some young men. The political division between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has contributed to the reduction of the effectiveness of the participation of Palestinian women in decision-making. The patriarchal nature of Palestinian political parties does not allow for meaningful participation of women or equitable representation. Disillusionment with any official politics or processes has turned many women, including young women, away from official participation, especially at the higher levels. Even when young women join political parties, they often end up leaving them because they do not find a supportive environment, in some cases feeling forced to become mouthpieces of the party's visions and policy, rather than free to express their own ideas. The lack of support for women's participation in leadership has also been evident in peace efforts between Palestine and Israel, as well as in the attempts for Palestinian internal reconciliation. Women have been absent from important reconciliation talks between Fatah and Hamas in Cairo and States Camp in 2014 and in Istanbul in 2020. As in previous ceasefire negotiations, women's instances were not represented at the negotiating table when the ceasefire was negotiated during and after the May 2021 war. During the escalation, UN Women held a virtual meeting with 10 leading national CSOs from the West Bank and the Gaza. Women's organizations highlighted the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, which was impacted heavily by bombings and risk exacerbating the precarious COVID-19 situation. In addition to that, they called for strengthening the Women, Peace and Security agenda. While women were not included in ceasefire talks, their inputs in the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Gaza remains fundamental. Dear guests, for all these reasons, UN Women organized an annual Open Day on Women, Peace and Security, providing a platform for Palestinian women, gender equality advocates, and the international community to reflect on the implementation of the UN Security Resolution 1325 in Palestine. This year, the event was organized in cooperation with the General Union of Palestinian Women and with generous funding from the government of Norway. The Open Day was held on the 19th and 20th October in Gaza in solidarity with women impacted by the war of May 2021, and to ensure that the voices from Palestinian women in Gaza are not left unheard. The event brought together women, including young women, from all over Palestine, representing different perspectives and coming from all sorts of backgrounds. It was a rare opportunity for Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza to be in the same room, talk to each other, recognize their differences, but fortify what brings them together as Palestinian women. The event also saw significant participation from Palestinian young men who, like young women, shed light on their vision, role, and the challenges that they encounter as gender equality advocates. Over the 2 days, the participant highlighted the important role Palestinian women can play for national reconciliation, took stock of the challenges to effectively implement the WPS Agenda in Palestine, and formulated recommendations to strengthen women's role in reconciliation and peace building, including for the establishment of a platform where Palestinian women leaders holding diverse political views and across generations can convene and strategize on how to increase women's participation in the Palestinian reconciliation process. Participants also agreed on the importance of holding democratic and free elections as soon as possible, with at least 30% quota reserved for women's representation. The importance of documenting the gendered impact of occupation on Palestinian women and girls, and of holding the occupation accountable for women's human rights violations were furthermore highlighted. Female and male youth peace builders recommended stronger inclusion of youth in gender-responsive peace building and recovery efforts, and systematic engagement with feminist organizations in pushing a gender equality agenda. Dear guests, in conclusion, it remains fundamental to support a strong women, peace, and security agenda in Palestine. Women's contribution to decision-making is critical, as global studies show that women's contribution increases the chance of reaching durable peace and reconciliation agreement. We must protect Palestinian women's right to take part in decision-making processes that affects them, their families, and the future of their country. I would like to thank again WILPF and the General Union of Palestinian Women for their invitation. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, and for both your opening remarks highlighting the internal and external challenges to implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Palestine. I would like to first turn to Ms. Sausan al-Shunnar to give us an overview of the general context on the status of women in occupied Palestinian territories and the status of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the context of occupation.
شكرا نهاركم سعيد جميعا.
Thank you and good day everyone. I would like to present you with an overview of the status of women in the occupied territories. And I would simply like to complement what my other colleagues will be presenting. In my presentation, I would like to concentrate on the UN Security Council resolution related to the Women for Peace and Security Agenda, especially the potential role of women in promoting efforts to prevent conflicts. Within the ongoing context of colonialism for more than 100 years, the Palestinian women find themselves in a very complex reality, whereas they often see that their private space, that is supposed to be their safe place, namely for Palestinian women and their families, is turned into an exposed space, as women have to face different forms of aggression, be it by the colonizer, the occupier, the occupation forces, and this is used as a way to terrorize the original dwellers of the land, to push them out of their lands, out of their homes, in order to promote the settlement activity and to impose full control over Palestine. As a result, Palestinian women find themselves obliged to face this existential threat, while they lack all proper tools of protection. Of course, there are many examples about that, and I will share with you a number of examples from our day-to-day life, emphasizing the impact of occupation. The illegal building of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories has been on the increase, especially since 2000, whereas the number of settlements increased drastically, and more than 6,650 settlers are benefiting from the lands of the West Bank, and this is based on the studies conducted by the Badil or Alternative Center. So they are monopolizing 30% of the resources of the West Bank, and that is in spite of the UN Security Council Resolution 334 of 2016, stipulating that settlement activities are illegal. Regardless, Israel totally disregards these international resolutions. The Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories in Bethlehem and another center called Karanagor are part of a number of non-governmental Israeli human rights organizations and have said in describing the behavior of settlers that their main slogan is that everything around us is ours and what's beyond that is also ours. And we all remember the famous scene or infamous scene that took place in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah when a settler told his Palestinian neighbor, well, if they don't take your house, or if I don't take your house, actually, they will do it anyway. So this is a way to depict the lives of Palestinian women. In addition to restrictions imposed on their freedom of movement, Palestinian women often face aggressions, physical aggressions. And we see that in a lot of cases, unfortunately, Palestinian women are also victims of domestic violence, especially for those residing in the neighborhood of settlements. Based on the OCHA study, Palestinian women in areas occupied by settlers do not really care that much about their rights or international instruments. They are mostly concerned by their most basic rights and by surviving. And their participation to public activities is quite limited. The study has also shown that men victims of violence replicate that within their own households, and women as well as children suffer from very severe mental health problems related to behavioral difficulties, difficulties in sleeping, etc. All of this makes it more difficult for women to access services, whereas women residing in villages along the barrier and living near settlement face a lot of difficulties in accessing the most basic services, and this is why we see that in these regions, women often leave school at a very young age, and we have a lot of cases of early marriages and early pregnancies. In addition to the fact that it's more difficult for these women to access services related to their reproductive health. This was mostly shown during the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, where even the most basic testing services and vaccination services were very much delayed in these areas. Furthermore, women's access to justice in these areas is greatly hindered because the official Palestinian Authority institutions do not have any real presence on the ground in these areas. To that, we add the difficulty women face in having access to water sources, whereas the settlements control 85% of underground waters, and the share of Palestinians does not exceed more than 30 liters per capita per day. Of course, this water shortage makes it more complicated for women to lead their daily lives and to accessing agricultural areas and to playing their expected roles. And for women in Jerusalem, we know that they face specific types of difficulties related to attempts to deprive them of their identity documents. They find a lot of difficulties in even achieving family reunification. And of course, this is all, or this all has an impact within the family. At the same time, we are witnessing continuous attempts to dislodge Palestinian families from their homes, of course, to make it more difficult for the Palestinians to live in these lands and to push them out of their land and to simply alter the demographic situation in these areas as it is known. This is a violation to the Geneva Fourth Convention, Articles 147, Articles 8 and 7 of the Rome Statute. As for the demolition of homes, between 2017 and 2019, I'll be specifically talking about this recent period in time, 1,786 homes were demolished. 2,573 citizens were pushed out of their homes during these 3 years. And I will talk more about the issue of demolition, quoting what Hanadi Abu Ramuz, a Palestinian woman, has told me once. She's from the village of Bet Hanina. And she says that when the occupation authorities demolished her home, she described that day as the day when they were treated as criminals because they are living in Jerusalem. I simply went into my house, into the rooms of my daughters, started combing their hair as they were crying because we had to leave the house. They demolished our life, they demolished our dream, and they will continue on demolishing everything to the end. As you know, this is done in different ways. They could force the Palestinian dweller to demolish his own home, or they could resort to their own equipment and they force the local family to pay for the service. And I will not be very lengthy, but this woman also in her story talked about the difficulties she had to face when they had to move back to live with her own parents, and to what extent her children missed their toys and their safe space, how much more difficulties they had to face, and how much they felt that their own space was restricted. Of course, they had to incur additional financial costs, and she was forced into finding a job. She started working in a nursery, and then she had to resume her education, which is perhaps a good sign that women are very much insisting on survival and on going on with their lives. I don't know if I have more time. Perhaps I can share more examples with you. Because I can perhaps talk quickly about the situation of the detainees in the Palestinian or in the Israeli prisons. We have 5,500 detainees, including minors, who are simply accused of posting unacceptable posts online and on social media. We know that women, wives of detainees, face their own difficulties, and there are also 26 female detainees, including 9 mothers. And I would like to note here that one of the female detainees, namely Shaza Auda, who's head of the Health Committees Union, has started providing a lot of health services to Palestinian women in her area. As for the civil space and freedoms, it's important to note that the occupation authority cracks down on the civil society organizations, preventing them from doing their job and from helping the rights owners. And this has a graver negative impact on women, preventing them from achieving their most basic rights, whereas 6 NGOs were shut down last week. And everyone heard of that. And these were institutions and organizations providing very essential services to the local community. Based on what was mentioned, we, as Palestinian human rights activists and women, remain fully convinced that we have to resort to international instruments in order to serve our just cause. But it's also time to accept reality and to see what would be the optimal way to deal with the current reality in order to mobilize the public opinion to help us get rid of the occupation. In addition to the kind of suffering that we experiment, as there are additional forces acting against the freedom of women, and given that there is no political will to adapt our national laws to the international instruments that were signed by the Palestinian Authority. Notwithstanding the internal divisions that have made it more difficult for us to assume our role as women, especially with reference to the Palestinian reconciliation process. At every instance and in all international fora, we speak up and we tell the world about our status and how we are still seeking to bring about change, dealing with more than 6,560 settlers who are responding with force, and millions of Palestinians who carry with them everywhere their stories, their dreams, including 49% of them who are women, each having her own story, her own culture, her own dream, and her own tie to her land, her own culinary habits. As a result of all the latter, Palestinian women find themselves subjected to systematic violence, deprivation, poverty, and attempts to control her by internal and external forces. And if this status continues and the hegemonous structure is not dismantled in order to put an end to the colonialist activity, especially according to what was stipulated in international resolutions, it would be impossible to move forward. Faced with this reality, these measures are more urgent than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving this very comprehensive overview. And you had the tough job of starting and giving the very overall view and linking the violence of occupation to the violence that women face in the home, speaking to settlements, and the way that impacts women, their access to water, access to agricultural land, but also then the impact of women, then their access to healthcare and violence in the home. And then, of course, speaking to the most recent issue of putting the Israeli government putting 6 Palestinian organizations on the terror list. So thank you for speaking to all these different factors that impact on women, their ability, women's status, women's ability to engage in peace and security, and also their ability to organize. I want to now turn to Ms. Amal Siam to speak to the situation in Gaza in particular, and if you could walk us through some of the impact of the siege on Palestinian women.
Good evening, and thank you for giving the opportunity to speak in this event related to WS and UNSCR 1324 after 25 on the 21st year anniversary of UNSCR 1325, and we always of course celebrate the anniversary of this resolution on the dire situation of the Palestinian people also, and in the face of the hegemony of the Israeli occupation on the Palestinian people, starting from Gaza, West Bank, and also what happened with regards to listing 6 women human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, and this is considered as a continuation of the occupation policy in order to oppress the Palestinian people and to limit the space of work of human rights organizations and organizations. Accordingly, always we are talking about this resolution under extraordinary situation. Also, the resolution itself reflects the Palestinian status. The Palestinian status is an extraordinary status. Of course, it doesn't compare to other situation of other countries with regards to UNSCR 1325. I will shed light on the practices of occupation with regards to the siege that is imposed on Gaza, and that is considered as well a violation of all forms of international agreements and conventions, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law as well. Since 15 years and even more, Gaza is under siege, under a severe siege, a punishment for Gaza since 2006. 2006 is not the beginning of the siege, because the siege began on Gaza since 2000, i.e. the same year that 1325 resolution was issued. Gaza is under isolation, is under siege, a form of siege, of extreme siege, without international community taking any steps, and without the United Nations and its member states deploying any effort to pressure Israel in order to comply with international law, to lift the siege and to stop all forms of group punishment imposed on Palestinians, especially in Gaza. Also, the siege came in par with 4 Israeli aggressions on Gaza, that of 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and lastly, the aggression of 1 May 2021. Of course, during these aggressions, women as well as Palestinians as a whole collectively were not secure from the bombs and rockets of the occupation. Women were not protected in the framework of these aggressions, under these aggressions as well. There was no international protection. Thousands of women were injured, thousands of Palestinian families, more than 500,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced in 2014, and 170,000 Palestinian families, half of them of women and young females, were forcibly displaced to schools and to the houses of relatives, streets, hospitals, during the aggression of May 1, 2021. More than 550 women died during these aggressions since 2008 until 2021. Also, the siege came at a time where crimes were committed, and violations, extreme violations against international human rights law were committed, and international humanitarian law, in the framework of when Israel dealt with the return demonstrations, whereby these Palestinians, these women Palestinians, of elderly children who held the banner of the right to return at the end of the siege. Also, they were unarmed, but they were attacked by the fire of the Israeli occupation. And despite what the aggression of Israel, the war crimes of Israel, crimes against humanity, we are we are facing an international community that remains silent, that gives Israel impunity, protects Israel. This is why Israel is also invading, is also attacking demonstrators, peaceful protesters. It is always acting as a state that is above the law. What did the siege do to the Palestinians socially, politically, economically? In truth, the siege has turned 2 million Palestinians, half of them are women, to inhabitants of a large prison that not exceeding 365 kilometers. They are completely isolated from the outside world. They are living in a crisis, in a humanitarian crisis. They are living in the framework of a crisis, a catastrophe, whereby poverty levels have increased to 53% of the population. And this average, this ratio of poverty in Gaza is 4 times more than the poverty level in the West Bank. Also, 1/3 of the population of Gaza live in extreme poverty, that women are paying the price of this poverty, and especially the families and households that are led by women, matriarchal households, and these are approximately 10% of households in Gaza, i.e. this clear increase in the rates of unemployment, which are the highest among women. The unemployment rate in Gaza is 52%, i.e. 47% are among women. So highest rate unemployment is among newly graduate females, which reach 68%, i.e. we are facing an increase and a clear development in the rate of women who have graduated, who have actually studied for 13 years. But unfortunately, these women are becoming part of those who are on the unemployment list. The participation of women in the labor force or the workforce is the least among the Arab countries and among the countries of the region, despite what we have mentioned, despite the development that we have seen in the education level among women, yet it only reached 20%, which is a decrease that would lead to a decrease in the participation of women in social life and public life and political life. As 1325 resolution has reiterated, 70% of the population of Gaza live a state of food insecurity. More than 30% of the population depend on humanitarian assistance, and this reiterates that Gaza lives a crisis and dire social and economic situation that really reflects in a deterioration in the health status of the inhabitant and population. Also, women are living a state of harsh health conditions because of the siege on Gaza. For example, medical apparatus are banned to Gaza, also deterioration in the health system, also a lack of medication, and the restriction of women and a restriction of the movement of patients. Patients are not allowed to leave Gaza, especially those who have chronic diseases. Cancer patients are not allowed to leave in order to continue their treatment outside of Gaza because all borders are closed and because freedom of movement is restricted. For example, when we take a sample sample of cancer, women cancer patients. The number of cancer patients in Gaza are 14,000, including 53% of them are women cancer patients. All cancer patients are breast cancer patients. Yearly or annually, we have approximately 316 breast cancer patients in Gaza, meaning that we register one case of breast cancer a day in Gaza. This concern is increasing when these patients are not allowed to leave to be treated abroad. Last year, around 30% of requests for treatment abroad were refused. Cancer patients are suffering of the lack of mammography in Gaza, lack of professional laboratories, the absence of hormonal and chemotherapy, So these patients have to undergo a mastectomy because their inability to get the proper treatment outside of Gaza, because of course the occupation does not issue permission for them to leave Gaza. Also, the siege has affected greatly and is still affecting in conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic spread in Gaza at a time where we had shortage of electricity, where electricity shortage reached 4 hours. So we had only 4 hours of electricity a day, and medical apparatus were banned from entering, lack of medication, delay of vaccination, and restriction of movement as well, and not allowing patients who require to be treated abroad to leave. This is why the COVID-19 pandemic and the coronavirus is a challenge for Palestinians in Gaza. Also, the siege and the division and the spread of the coronavirus and the aggression on Gaza led to a fertile land for an increase of gender-based violence and an increase in violence against women as well. We are talking about an increase in a ratio of widows. 6%, 101 women only were added on the list of widows after the 2021 aggression. 38% of Gaza women suffer, married women or who were previously married suffer, and of one form or the other of violence. Violence reaches its extreme state when women are killed. 5 women were killed until today in Gaza. In honor crimes or mysterious situation. Last year, more than 20 women were killed. Accordingly, we are facing a dire economic, social, political situation, deteriorating situation with regards to the status and situation of Palestinian women. Also, when we talk about activists, women activists and advocates, and we talk about the siege, like Mrs. Maries mentioned, the siege also led to the division of women movements and their inability to plan, to organize, to meet, to unite, and to participate and partake in the national events and to represent Palestinian women on the national level. Also, we in Gaza, in the Gaza sector, we are unable, as women, we are unable to go abroad to participate in the international arena. Hence, our voice as women and our colleagues in the West Bank really are appreciated when they raise their voices vis-a-vis the issues of women throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. But it should be said that the siege did not allow women to participate in international fora. Also, the siege and the division has decreased the participation of women in equal participation of women and integration of women in all efforts that lead to the promotion of security and peace. Also, my colleague mentioned that there is an absence of women participation in reconciliation and absence of participation of women in recovery committees, reconstruction committees, COVID-19 committees, and also for planning for the post-conflict era or phase. What is required in truth, the basis of the story is the occupation. The international community is requested to shoulder their responsibility vis-a-vis the occupation of Palestine. The international community is required to pressure to hold elections in a manner that allows Jerusalem to participate equally. Also, international community is requested to move all advocates of Palestinian rights to end the siege and to open all borders and to end the humanitarian crisis in Gaza sector and to achieve the rights of the Palestinian people and to implement the resolution 1325. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Siam, for this detailed insight of the situation in Gaza, the multiple waves of violence that women have faced, that the population of Gaza has faced, and the economic, social, and other ways in which that hamper the different aspects that hamper women's participation, political participation, their ability to really take part in any peace and security. I would like to turn to Dr. Selma Nims so that we can incorporate the situation of Palestinian refugees into the picture. Dr. Nims, can contextualizing Jordan's role as a country that hosts many Palestinian refugees, can you tell us a little bit more about Palestinian women's refugees in Jordan and their situation?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mrs. Salma. Could you please select a language channel so we can hear the interpretation? Thank you so much.
Oh, English. Okay. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go back again. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm honored to be speaking among these amazing women who are actually fighting inside Palestine for the rights of Palestinians and Palestinian women in specific. And as we've heard, in Palestine, the same actually applies to Palestinians and Palestinian women in Jordan. There is a lot of heterogeneity when we try to understand the status specifically of Palestinian women in Jordan. I myself come from a family whose father was a refugee who came in 1948. He became a Jordanian. We never had a refugee. He had some refugee status, but he lost the card and he started his own life. And now we are fully Jordanians and we do not we do not, even we talk about our origins, but the definition of being a refugee, whether it's through living in the camp or being defined as a refugee within the context, is really varied and variable, and affects your access to rights, your access to services, and whatever you are suffering from. And if I want to look, when we talk about Jordan, definitely Jordan is one of the countries who've given the nationality to a high percentage of Palestinian refugees, specifically those who came earlier. So Palestinian refugees, even those within the camps, the percentage of those who have the Jordanian nationality is 85%, and those who are outside the Palestinian camps are 96%. Those who are left without nationality are mainly those who come from Gaza, and obviously Jordan has a strong political stand on not giving and identifying those in a different way, even from those who do not have nationality, but they're not from Gaza. Yet, an overall analysis of the situation is that, especially for those who are considered refugees, is that of marginalization, which is sometimes, in many cases, similar to the marginalization of poor Jordanians living in marginalized areas. And there is this context which becomes more complicated, more difficult in terms of access to services, access to documentation, access to education, as that status in terms of nationality decreases. And that's the reality. Now, when we look at that and at women in that context, we will realize that then these realities get more complex, inequality becomes more deepened in a context where even Jordanian women, as mentioned by our first, by Maris and others, that there is patriarchy and that women, effectively, what women suffer from within our society in terms of social complexity, discrimination, in terms of access to opportunity, in terms of the complexities that even Jordanian women face: transportation, care services, childcare services, wage discrimination, which all becomes more complicated if you are a Palestinian refugee. So we definitely, and now when we start looking at how COVID affected, we know, for example, that Jordanian women and everybody with the nationality have access to the services of the government, whether it's education, access to health services, and that in a way is high in Jordan in terms of percentage, but it's becoming more difficult in terms of quality. And then access to jobs become more complex for women and for Palestinian women in that context. But actually, when you look at the numbers, you find that Palestinian women are more breadwinners and more active, even if in a informal setting within that context. The latest study on the effects of COVID on the Palestinian refugees showed that 29% of female Palestinian refugees are the breadwinners, and that they work in different areas of work, 13% in domestic workers, 7% working for wages. In the service sector, 44% of them work in the service sector, in construction 11%, and in food and beverage 11%. 75% of the study was carried out on a rapid socioeconomic study on the status, what affected the Palestinian women and men and women. 75% of the females reported losing their jobs. And this is a very difficult situation. Now, looking at this in the context of a political discourse that is trying to minimize the role of the UNRWA, which is in a way trying to dissolve the concept of being a refugee and going back and having the right of return, means that the Palestinians, specifically Palestinian women and youth, end up losing the ability and the rights and access to opportunities in Jordan and in other areas. We know this happens in other countries that have refugees. So because of this political game where there is more pressure on the UNRWA, then we see that Palestinians are not even gaining their access and right to go back to Palestine, and at the same time losing having less and less ability to access services that the UNRWA historically has been giving them, not only in terms of education, but in cash assistance, in working in providing jobs. We see a lot of Palestinian women working in home-based businesses, and that needs access to loans, which usually the UNRWA is those who give it to them. So, and at the same time, when we see what happened also in COVID in terms of online studying, we know that with already girls, we know that the Palestinians put a lot of focus on educating their children because they see that education is what is going to save their children, give them an opportunity in life. But of course, again, with the COVID situation, with the online studying, poor people living in marginalized areas, and then looking at those who are living in refugee areas, those refugees who are living in camps and are not Jordanians and do not have social security numbers are the ones who have suffered the most in not being able to access education, which means we still do not have the numbers, but we know that many young girls are the highest to be pushed out of the education system because there is no access to tablets, internet, and other areas. And those who have left for 1 year, the chances of them going back is definitely much lower. A recent study that was done by the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development mentioned the difficulties that are suffered by the youth of the Palestinian refugees, and specifically showed that on women, the situation is again more difficult. Women have less access to cultural outlets, and now they are facing more difficulty in accessing education and jobs because of social constructs and negative social attitudes, and in setups where some refugee camps have high, there is insecurity areas that are insecure, where there is a drug abuse, so they do not want their daughters to go out and be exposed to that structure. Within that, there is another study that was done by an organization called TOMI, which works with youth in local communities and in the 10 refugee camps. 24% of the women in that study said that they feel that they are discriminated against on the basis of gender. And divorced women and single women expressed the highest exposure to stress and sociocultural pressure, psychological pressure. As in the Jordanian context, the gender-based violence increased in a very similar percentage during COVID, 33% for women in Jordanian, all in Jordan, 31% reported for Palestinian refugee women. We have to also say that Jordan has worked a long time ago on access to services. We still have our gaps. We do have a law on domestic violence, and that law and access to services is open to all those who are on the Jordanian land, regardless of nationality, in addition to specific services provided to the Palestinian refugees. Now, I want to here just quickly talk about 1325 in terms of Jordan. Our first JONAP, to be honest, when we worked on it, the focus was Jordanians, and the consultations were done in the Syrian refugee camps, specifically because when we started doing it was at the height of the influx of the refugee, of the situation, the Syrian situation. Now, as we started implementing in Jordan, we thought, as we're now going into the consultation for the second phase, we thought it's high time to include Palestinian refugees. So we carried out consultations in refugee camps, and we received a lot of input from the Palestinian refugees, and we started building networks with community-based organizations in the Palestinian refugees areas and the camps in order to reach out. But from a Jordanian perspective, I think what we have been doing since we adopted 1325 at a regional and international level is actually to start asking the hard questions. What are we doing here? Is 1325 and the consecutive resolutions about making life a bit easier for Palestinian refugees or for the Palestinians who are under occupation. Are we all, and this is, I think, a question that we all need to ask ourselves as female, and feminist activists. How are people looking at us, asking for improving the lives of Palestinian women, when we see that there is no real commitment from a regional perspective and a global perspective to end this occupation, to end the suffering of the Palestinians, to establish the right of return to all Palestinians, including someone like my father? We cannot, there is a message of disconnect, and it could affect the legitimacy of the feminist movement in the Arab region if we continue to just say we are improving the lives of women on our land. And this is very important. And every time, as Jordan, in any regional and global event, we have raised this question, because you do not come and pat on the shoulder of any country and say, okay, you're doing things better for women. Women are joining the security sector, but then human rights is not established. I am not going to celebrate women in military if in the end women in the Gendarmerie is going to stop a demonstration against what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And this happened to us down in the streets. So when we have to have an alignment between the ethical and the concept of resistance and the concept of working on and supporting Palestinian women refugees, but we need to expose the hypocrisy at the global level that resistance is not seen as a right for the Palestinians, whether it's inside the Palestinian, all Palestine from the sea to the river, or whether for Jordanians and Palestinians in Jordan who want to stand and say that there is a right that we need to stand for. And actually, we sent a letter, JNCW, with the coalition on 1325 to the 5 donors for the implementation of 1325 on Jordan during the situation in Sheikh Jarrah and what happened in the rest of the Palestinian, historical also Palestine, that there is now an ethical question that we all need to stand and ask ourselves. Are we going to just implement JONAPs at a national level and local level without asking the world to stand by its commitment to the rights of the Palestinian people to have their own land? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the whole analysis and intersectional analysis, looking at class, looking at all these issues, but especially for your last point, really hitting the nail on the head with the women, peace and security being part of a broader discussion on peace and security and human rights. And there's no women's engagement if there's no citizens' engagement. But so thank you very much for your remarks. I will go to Ms. Rima Nazal now to hear from her about, in light of the challenges that have been explained so well, and the gender and the analysis that has been put forward by Ms. Sausan, Ms. Amal, and Dr. Salma. If you could give us, tell us why it's important to support the implementation of the Women, Peace, Security Agenda in Palestine, the efforts that have been made, as well as some of the challenges that you have faced.
Thank you, Salma. Good evening to you all. At the onset, I would like to thank UN Women, our partner in this project, as well as the Norwegian government for providing their support to this project. Also, I would like to thank WILPF that facilitated this workshop. Everything in Palestine is difficult, is hard. There are many challenges, many obstacles, even those related to NAP, related to implementation of Resolution 1325. Resolution 1325 is a challenge to us per se, even when we adopted, especially when we adopted it. Hence, we have to mention why we have adopted this resolution that was issued in 2000. in the year 2000. And what's the benefit of this resolution? Because now, after 21 years of this resolution, we are all evaluating, assessing the solution. When will this resolution be fully implemented and executed, especially in Palestine? International resolutions are not implemented. The Security Council resolutions are not implemented, and the General Assembly resolutions as well. Hence, today we are having a comprehensive assessment in Palestine. Last week, we were in the Gaza. We had an open day, an open discussion, a high-level discussion between policymakers outside. And this open day also tackled certain points and assess certain points. So when we adopted especially the GUPW before the union, before setting, before having a general of course, vision of the resolution, there were haphazard implementation. GUPW placed a women vision for the implementation of 1325, a vision that goes in par with the socio-economic context of Palestine, meaning that we have established a positive reading, because of course the resolution has weaknesses, has strength, and we promoted the strength and advantages of this resolution. This resolution goes in par with our vision. We are living layers of violence, and our national action program in Palestine since the occupation has shifted towards linking between the needs of Palestinian women to self-determine, to be free, to move freely, and also we are facing a political aggression, oppression because of the occupation. And this occupation really worsens what we are facing from the patriarchal society in Palestine. This is what we have seen. Also, we did not concentrate on the negative points, the weaknesses, because this resolution does not have a schedule, an agenda, a specific time frame. This resolution did not link itself, or the resolution did not call to be linked with other Palestinian resolutions. It was, of course, linked to the CEDAW agreement, international humanitarian law. But we knew that resolution was not directed to Palestinian women, but to the women of the world. So it will be general. We have adopted the resolution, we have established the vision, and we have established a plan that is based on the pillar of the resolution. The 4 pillars of the resolution, as you know, is participation, protection, accountability, prevention. Also, we were very interested in accountability because, of course, the resolution called for to hold all war criminals accountable, also to avoid impunity. The Israeli occupation is not being held accountable because we know there are double standards in UN resolutions. Some resolutions are implemented in certain places. Armies are sent to implement these resolutions, while in Palestine, international resolutions are not being implemented, are being transcended and overcome. And this is our problem. Resolution 242, 383 are unable to be implemented, even if there is international will, because the settlement has taken over the land. The land today has been divided, as they say in Europe. It is Swiss cheese, like Swiss cheese. Cantons isolated from one another, not related to one another. We have We are seeing annexation, confiscation daily, everyday announcement of new settlements everywhere. Hence, it is very hard today to have an independent Palestinian state in the face of this reality. But we had a positive reading even despite all of that. And the civil society today, as a society, we have more than one plan. We have actually 3 plans since 2019 when we have adopted the resolution. We have established 3 plans with regards to the government. And of course, the resolutions are directed to governments. Until now, there were 2 plans established by the government since 2017-21, and 2021-2024, the second generation of the plans that this is more on the international dimension. And of course, the Ministry of Women and the High National Commission are, of course, right to concentrate on that, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a dual conflict, and it is not because, as we know, the balance of powers is shifted towards the occupation completely. So liberation, independence are linked to the international will to implement resolutions, ethical will, because today the Palestinian cause is an ethical cause. The world has to call for the implementation of these resolutions, like what happened in South Africa when they decided to dismantle the apartheid. And to stop the English supremacy in South Africa. So hence South Africa was liberated because South Africa would not have been liberated only by its army, by its will. And this is also the case in Palestine. It needs this dimension accordingly. Quickly, I know I do not have enough time. I do believe that I want to talk more about recommendations at the onset. In this stage, I go back to the UN. The UN system that was established after World War II is an archaic system. It cannot help people to liberate and cannot help people to access to justice, the justice that they seek. In addition to that, the United Nations is a politicized assembly today. It is not only politicized, it is also controlled by the US and the veto system in the Security Council as well is very dangerous, and because among the vetoes that the US launched, 2/3 of the vetoes of the US vetoes were in the face of the Palestinian cause. So we have to develop the system of the UN system. We have to change the veto system in the United Nations in order to have a greater role of other members. And so the veto will not be only or subject to the will of one country. Perhaps we need 3/4 of Security Council in order to issue a certain resolution. Because it is only then that people will have access to justice. But to have one country controlling the vetoes, controlling the implementation of resolutions, this is something that is unacceptable, but will actually exacerbate the crises and the problems in the world. The second recommendation, I do believe that in Palestine and via the Minister of Women and the National High and the Supreme Committee really request a new resolution, because Resolution 1325 and the later resolution did not mention occupation and the crisis because of the occupation. Perhaps recommendation 30 in this field really filled the gap, but it remains a recommendation. We need a resolution that talks about the occupation, mentions the occupation very clearly, and also talks about linking local resolutions with visions. So the United Nations should allow that all resolutions that were undertaken to be linked, resolutions taken, on the national level to be linked to this resolution, because we cannot, because 1325 cannot, of course, be implemented without implementation of 242. Resolution 1325 will not liberate Palestine. It is linked to resolutions that are related to the Palestinian cause. It could become a power. It could become a pressure, a means of pressure, because there is discrepancy in this resolution, and we have registered it in Palestine. When men failed in achieving peace and security, this mission, this great mission, this complex mission is given to marginalized women who are seeking a place in among decision makers, despite the fact that I am, of course, the coordinator of the Committee for the Implementation of Resolution 1325. I cannot answer Palestinian women and the grassroots when they ask me, when will the resolution be implemented? How can women implement such a resolution when men themselves were unable to implement this resolution? Of course, in Palestine, we have merged the reconciliation. Perhaps the Norwegian representative talked about it. Also, Dr. Maries talked about this dimension, that of reconciliation, and we have included in 1325. Since the division, we have discussed this issue. We have included it in the vision. We have included it in the plan. Despite the difficulty of the implementation of the plan on the level of reconciliation, because of the complex division, the complex landscape that is exacerbating because of the polarization between the parties of the division, because we cannot acknowledge that the Palestinian division or conflict is not a particular division. It is a social division as well as social conflict. There is a social, intellectual conflict about the role of women in Palestinian society, about Palestinian laws and regulations and legislations. These matters should be discussed openly on the table. I believe in the Open Day in Gaza, we have launched the idea of sitting together on one table in order to agree on the legislations and laws that we want to implement, because there is a great gap in the laws and the division hampered the drafting and issuance of laws. Also, it was hampered by the postponement of elections. Hence, we have launched this discussion because men cannot agree on conflict while women sit on the margins waiting until political division or political conflict is resolved to start their legal fight. We said that both paths should be in parallel. The social path and the political path should move in parallel. In the participation of women in the reconciliation process and in discussing the laws related of women in order to be able to move forward in reconciliation and national unity. Thank you, Salma, for allowing me to talk at length. And hopefully these discussions will bear fruits, bear positive fruits. and will also have positive impact on Palestinian women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rima Nassal, and thank you for highlighting the link between and the need, if we are to implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, it needs to be part of a much more accountable, robust human rights or international law system. We can't just pick and choose the resolutions that are to be implemented. Thank you for also bringing the many dimensions of the conflict and highlighting the need to address all of them in parallel, not in order to actually have meaningful movement on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Last but not least, I would like to turn to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Ms. Rima Salim. In light of what has been shared by the panelists, how does the occupation in the context of the of Palestine, or in the context of the occupied Palestinian territories, including the siege of Gaza and the highly militarized environment throughout the occupied territories, how does all of that contribute to violence against women?
Yeah, thank you, Salma. And first of all, I'd like to thank WILPF, the General Union of Palestinian Women, and also the government of Norway for organizing this very timely event and also for inviting me. And in response to your question, I'm going to actually draw on the report on the mission that my predecessor had carried out to Palestine and Israel back in 2016, where she highlighted actually very clearly the linkages between the prolonged occupation and violence against women and girls. And what she actually stressed in her report was that Israeli occupation permeates all aspects of the lives of women and girls and contributes directly and indirectly to the GBV that they experience. Now, it's very, very unfortunate, of course, that 5 years later, these linkages and these findings continue to be relevant, and in fact, if anything, continue to be more exacerbated and more serious. Now, this is not, of course, to say that men and boys do not also experience the full brunt of the occupation. I think Maurice mentioned, however, that the gendered consequence of the occupation means that women bear a disproportionate hardship arising from the human rights and humanitarian law violations brought about by the occupation. And we may ask ourselves exactly how this gendered impact of the occupation is inflicted. I think all my fellow panelists spoke at length to that, but in her report and also in the reports of other UN special procedures and treaty bodies, the restrictions on the freedom of movement was highlighted, the restrictions on family reunification, the increased settler violence, house demolitions, arbitrary detention of women and girls, including human rights defenders and NGOs. Not to mention, of course, the blockade on Gaza and the several rounds of violence in and on Gaza. And of course, these are but very few examples of a reality that is very well documented and that my fellow speakers also, many of them live on a daily basis. Now, collectively, these violations cause anxiety, depression, threaten the lives of women and girls, cause severe injuries, and limit their enjoyment of basic human rights, from education to freedom of expression to political participation. I mean, the list is quite long. And of course, we all know, and other panelists have spoken to that as well, how COVID has exacerbated this situation and has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis and existing vulnerabilities. Now, it's also clear that the patriarchal norms that were referred to and that are already alive and well in different parts of Palestinian society have also been entrenched as a result of occupation, and that the occupation has also exacerbated the fragmentation of Palestinian society, which is fragmented not just politically, but also physically. And that collectively has, of course, affected the meaningful participation and inclusion of women in political processes and in peace building efforts. We have also seen, of course, the continued onslaught on Palestinian civil society and NGOs, including those that represent, defend, and serve the interests of women and children, and that seek to ensure their participation and their representation. And the recent designation by Israel of 6 Palestinian human rights NGOs as terror organizations, including, as I said, organizations that really work to help women and children, is but a recent example of the kind of violations that are experienced on a daily basis. Now, of course, many of these organizations are well known to the UN entities, to special procedures like my own. And in that sense, we consider that this recent misuse of counterterrorism measures can be considered a reprisal for the work that these organizations do and for the cooperation that they render to us and other UN and human rights bodies and organizations. Now, I would also like to stress the fact that the absence of a full-fledged and sovereign governmental authority in all parts of Palestinian territory, which is occupied, hampers the implementation of policies and initiatives that are needed to combat violence against women, even when there is political will and desire to do so. And just to mention a small but concrete example, if a Palestinian police officer wants to actually reach a woman that is a victim of violence in Area C, he cannot do that because it's under Israeli control, and he's not even allowed to go there.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. Can I ask you how violence against women is an obstacle, to tell us more about how it is an obstacle to the full implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, especially in the context of Palestine?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Salma. And as you know, violence against women is prohibited under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, which both, by the way, Israel and Palestine have ratified. And I want to stress here that both the Israeli government and the Palestinian government are responsible for applying it to all persons under their jurisdiction and effective control. Not only that, but they are actually also responsible for the actions of non-state actors that are under their jurisdiction and effective control, and that might be committing violence against Palestinian women and girls. Now, if we look also at Resolution 1325, we know that this resolution affirms the importance of participation of women and their inclusion of gender perspective in peace negotiations, in humanitarian planning, in peacekeeping operations, and post-conflict building and governance. And in fact, my predecessor, again, following her mission to Israel and Palestine in 2016, she had recommended the implementation of Resolution 1325 with the full inclusion of women in peace and development efforts. And she had also stressed the need for adequate and sufficient budget allocations to be accorded for that. Of course, this hasn't happened for many reasons that we all need. But I wish to also stress that CEDAW continues to be the normative framework for eliminating violence against women in both times of conflict and times of peace. And therefore, it's also the framework for implementing 1325 related interventions. And so there's very clear, to my mind, synergies between CEDAW on one hand and Resolution 1325, and they strengthen the operationalization of gender equality. Now, when it comes to dealing with violence against women, the legal and political context has not progressed significantly towards ensuring gender equality and equal access to rights, including in Palestine. We heard that also from my sisters on this panel. So on one hand, my mandate, like others, has welcomed that the state of Palestine has acceded to CEDAW without reservation in 2014. My mandate has also welcomed that Article 99 of the Penal Code excluded honor crimes against women as considerations of extraneous circumstances to allow for a lesser criminal sentence. And here, allow me to say that if these advances were made, it's in large part thanks also to the tireless efforts of Palestinian civil society organization, including women organization. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that limited progress has been made by the Palestinian government in implementing the provisions of CEDAW, including by not publishing it in the official gazette. Thereby, it didn't have a legally binding force within the Palestinian legal system. And also the fact that family protection bill has not been enacted, and also the fact that the penal code has experienced limited progress in addressing sexual offenses. Now, coming back also to the political will that I spoke about, even where the Palestinian authorities have demonstrated political will and commitment, such as, for example, through the adoption of a forward-looking, ambitious national plan of action for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, these efforts have been hampered through the lack of sufficient resources and infrastructure, including those needed to provide gender-responsive activities. And Palestinian women have still not been given the right to participate meaningfully in political process, including those related to the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, to violence prevention activities, to human security initiatives, as well as generally to peace building as mandated by the resolution. Now, there's one final point I would like to make, and that is that any discussion on this right now and on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is, in my view, incomplete if we also don't look at the gaps and in policies and practice that Israel has as the occupying power when it comes to preventing and addressing issues of violence against women in its own systems, on its own practice, and which were also detailed in the report of my predecessor following her mission. Because, of course, by extension, they affect also Palestinians, so Palestinians that are also Israeli citizens, but also Palestinians, as we said, that are living under Israeli occupation. And so if we look at the Israeli National Plan of Action for Women, Peace and Security Agenda, we notice that there is, for example, an absence of participation by women of all groups in this plan of action, including Israeli citizens of Palestinian or Arab origin and Bedouin women, just to mention a few. So this, again, by association, impacts the implementation of the agenda in Palestine as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those excellent points and for bringing also the situation of Palestinian women or Palestinian women in Israel, in the state of Israel, and the very important links that you are making, between violence against women and the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, between also the ongoing occupation, the outlawing of the 6 NGOs. You have really brought many of the things, reiterated many of the things that our distinguished panelists have brought to the table. And thank you all so much for your time. All our panelists, I'm afraid we've taken 10 extra minutes of everybody's time. So thank you to all the panelists for their insights and knowledge, and also to all the participants for sticking with us. And thank you so much also to, again, Norway and UN Women, to the WILPF, MENA, and the Women, Peace and Security teams, to GUPW, the General Union of Palestinian Women, and to all those who supported this event. Thanks also to the brilliant interpreters. And this event will be available on WILPF's YouTube and Facebook channels. And so thank you all again for your time and your interventions, and have a good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry again for us not being able to take any questions because of the lack of any remaining time, we will see if there's a way also to direct your questions to the to those that you have asked. I see there's a question also for UN Women there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.